Your grandfather said, a great man doesn't seek to lead. He's called to it. And he answers. And if your answer is no, you'll still be the only thing I ever needed you to be. My son.
What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the Film Jump with Jesse and Chris. So we're going to be talking about Dune, Part 1. We're a little late on this, but we figured we'd bring you our review of it, seeing as the second one is coming out soon, and we're super excited. So let's jump right into it. Dune is based on the Frank Herbert novel of the same name, The Journey of Paul Atreides, and if you're on this video, you've seen it or read it or both. We're going to review the movie, not the book, and how well of an adaptation it is or that kind of thing. This is just strictly based on the movie.
Yeah, strictly as a cinema experience.
Right off the bat, I think this movie is amazing. Fantastic movie, directed by Denis Villeneuve, starring Timothée Chalamet, Oscar Isaac, Josh Brolin, Jessica Ferguson.
Zendaya, Stellan Skarsgård.
Yeah, well, we'll get into it, but she's not really even starring in it. She's very small role in the first one.
They're stars in there.
Yeah,
in it.
yeah.
It's not so much starring, but yeah.
So right off the bat, I think Denis Villeneuve deserves kind of like its own discussion in how he directs his films, because his style lends incredibly well to this film in particular. And I mean, it was like a passion project for him. The way he films everything and the way he collaborates with his cinematographer and all the technical aspects of the film, this movie is firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, and it's one of those, the director who finally gets to make their passion project is sometimes a double-edged sword. When you see something like Peter Jackson make King Kong, it's one of those things where everyone's so inclined to indulge every impulse he has. You end up with a 3-hour King Kong movie that kind of feels a little uneven and unsatisfying because no one was willing to say no to him, and he just wanted to have everything that he could have in it. And so there was that fine line where maybe this wasn't going to turn out well, but he delivered a hell of a cinematic experience. And it's one of those things where, like, the aesthetics, the cinematography, the pacing, the sort of structure, the staging of it all, the whole energy and vibe of the film is just top notch. It's just very cool.
Yeah, we talked about it before recording, and that it kind of feels like the antithesis of like a J.J. Abrams project, where it's very calm. You can see it. It's pulled back. It feels very direct, precise, but not boring, and still kinetic, but almost in such a more, dare I say, use the word, the word epic. That word gets tossed around, but I think Dune especially fits that word better than a lot of movies do. Epic,
engaging in a way that pulls you in, as opposed to dazzling you with what display it is. It's sort of drawing you in and coiling you into the experience. And it's not a flawless film. I'm not sure if I love it quite as much as you, but it's one of those. The first time I saw it, I was a little lukewarm on it, but every time I've seen it since, and the more I think about it since, all of the pieces really do flow together really well, and it just kind of sings. It moves along quite well. Maybe a little odd pacing here and there, but it's just kind of, everything is sort of firing on all cylinders. The cast is excellent. The production design, the production value, the visuals, the sci-fi, the world building, it's just really engaging, and it's sort of like upper echelon sci-fi. There's not a whole lot of sci-fi films being handled this sort of seriously, is what people might say, like this earnestly
and with class.
Yeah, with a sense of kind of class. That's kind of the way that Lord of the Rings kind of felt for fantasy. Like, we're handling it in a sort of serious way that's not like goofy fun time fairies, magical gumdrops, whatever nonsense. Like, this isn't Star Wars sci-fi where everything's kind of a joke and everything's kind of pretty and colorful. This is sort of sci-fi by, a higher standard, and it's aged very well in the last couple of years.
And it's a timely thing that, with the second one coming out very soon, we're going to watch that at the fan event and have a review for that one fairly quickly. But with this one in particular, you can look back at Denis' prior films, Blade Runner 2049, Arrival, Enemy, Sicario, Prisoners. Those in particular, you can see they have like this same kind of vibe, and when you watch them, you're like, man, this is a Denis Villeneuve film. And that's one of the best compliments I think you can give it, is that it's got his own stamp, but it feels very approachable from everybody. It's not like watching a Zack Snyder movie where you might think it's awesome or not, but
style,
it's not everybody. His style
the
isn't
style
for
might
everybody.
might turn a few people off. Yeah, in the same way that you drop in a Christopher Nolan movie and you can immediately sort of tell Denny does have his own style, and his aesthetics is an overused term, but his execution of the process, the way that he stages action, the way he films it, the way he edits, the way his scores complement the visuals. There's a calmness. You're not really removed from it, but there's this very sort of, you're just kind of observing it as it's unfolding. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of intent happening where you're feeling like you're watching a very like highly orchestrated movie of good guy, bad guy, joke behind the scene. Like it just kind of, every scene is taken as being what it is in a real situation, the real conversations. It doesn't feel like things are patterned in a sort of typical way. It's just really well handled, and to see it in a sci-fi movie like this it's really nice.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like one of the few jokes in the movie comes from Duncan Idaho, and he says to Paul Atreides like, "Oh, I can tell you've been working out," and he goes, "Really?" And he says, "No." Like that's like the most jokey kind of part in the entire movie. Yeah,
and
not to say that it's too serious, but it's just,
but anything else, it's not the film being self-aware of humor. It's sort of just kind of situational where you as a viewer might be like, oh, that's a little funny. Like the deaf Harkonnen who kind of has a weird voice. It's like the characters don't laugh or make a smirk about it. They point out that he's deaf and then he has kind of a weird voice. And it's like someone might get
realistic.
Someone might get a chuckle out of that, but it's not, none of it's overstated. Yeah. Nothing about really any of Denny's films is really like overblown or overstated. There's a sort of a minimalism, a sort of only the essentials, a sort of stripped down kind of purity, kind of, nothing is inessential that's shown.
It's almost hard to really articulate and put to words like why a Denis Villeneuve film feels like it is, but I think it's a perfect amalgamation of all the separate parts of the production. For example, Dune Part 1, which real quick, I do want to say I love the fact that it was just advertised as Dune, and then only when the movie finally released did it say Part 1, and it's like for a split second. Yeah. It kind of beat that whole Part 1 nonsense that a lot of movies like Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 fell victim to.
Yeah, I personally think it's a gimmick that people got tired of as soon as they kind of brought it back. Like as soon as Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows did Part 1, Part 2, it kind of just became this thing of you're watching half of a story, you're watching half of an arc. You're gonna get a cliffhanger ending and something that feels unresolved. So it also did the same thing where at the end credits it said it Chapter 1. Right. So which I think is kind of the classier thing. Now, granted, if Part 2 flops or sucks or doesn't get made or something, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. But all the things we've heard about Dune Part 2 indicates that it's excellent. So
and I've heard that when he first made this, it was kind of like in the background that, look, if I'm going to jump in on this project here, I'm going to tell it in the way it deserves to be told, and that's in a two-parter at least.
Yeah, and they didn't do the commitment to do two parts and film it simultaneously and do the whole Lord of the Rings thing. It was really much like, well, you can do your Part 1 however you want to do Part 1, and it was just sort of the confidence of the filmmakers that they were going to make something successful enough that there was going to be worth telling the rest of the story. So the film has a little bit of that. It feels a little unresolved. It doesn't feel, it feels like you're getting, not necessarily, oh, this is a half of a movie and it's unsatisfying, but it does feel like it's a setup for the resolution of the story.
We'll get to that in a little bit when we talk about kind of like the last act of this movie. But what I was saying before is that how this movie is like a perfect amalgamation of all of its parts. We talk about, if you've heard us before say, films like this especially are basically miracles of collaboration when every aspect of the production is firing on all cylinders and it's just sheer craft on display. And the movie walked away with 6 Academy Awards and all the technical sides of things, and that's what you want to see in a theater experience. People talk about this movie has to be seen on the biggest screen possible, and that is true of this movie. Best sound, original score, production design, cinematography, these are the quintessential things to a visual auditory experience.
You want the visuals strong, you want the music strong, the sound design, the production design,
and it goes more than that, because you look at this and you compare it to Prisoners, Arrival, Blade Runner 2049, and the cinematography almost feels like they're two different, at least two, but like it almost feels like it's all Deakins, and I say that as a compliment to Fraser, who was the director of photography for Dune, and he won the Academy Award for it, and deservedly so. They had a really cool, unique way of shooting digitally and then film or overlay or whatever.
Yeah,
they did
it was a wild process of sort of, they initially shot digitally and then they did the visual effects digitally, but then sort of filmed it,
rescanned it.
Yeah,
it
was a unique process to kind of give the thing a sort of uniform texture over the visual effects and practical effects all whole. And Christopher Nolan praised it. He said that it was one of the best sort of, but something of the combination or mixture of practical effects and digital effects. And he was mostly speaking to the way that they did the digital effects after filming digitally and then refilmed it back onto celluloid. So the image is a little soft because you're kind of going through generations, but there's a uniformity that you get from that kind of adds this sort of filmic texture over all of it. And so the CGI just feels that much more sort of ingrained into the
it definitely, it sells it so much better. It feels more tangible, maybe.
Yeah.
And they did the same thing with the Batman. It was the same director of photography.
Yeah.
And you get directors like James Cameron and Christopher Nolan, who are both all-time greats in their own manner, both complimenting Denis, who is not anymore a new director. He has quite a few films under his belt now, and they're all fantastic.
Yeah.
But going back to the movie, when you watch it, he's got like the composition of everything, the scale, and how James Cameron said with Avatar, how he wanted to present it like you're watching it through a window, and not just a movie. This feels like that. I feel like when you watch this on a big screen in the theater, you're like transported to Dune, and it's so bombastic, the audio and the visual. It's just
there's just a certain element of how it's executed that it feels like you're just kind of witnessing the events unfold. Like you are getting that window into another world. It doesn't feel like they're performing for the camera or staging things for like the most showy way. It just feels very much filmed in a sort of minimalist and naturalistic kind of fundamental, like stick into the fundamentals kind of a way. It's hard to explain, but it's compelling.
Yeah, let's talk about the cast for a minute, because we can give credit to Denis all day long with his craft on display here. But the cast, every single person is very good, if not amazing. And some of them don't really bring like groundbreaking performances, so to speak. They're all really just, really bringing it.
And really in a way that sort of you don't see them and just think, oh, that's Dave Bautista. They just feel like they fall right into their characters. It feels like you're watching genuine performances of genuine characters, even though these might be actors and actresses you've seen a lot of other things. This isn't like celebrity all-star cast kind of a thing. Even Jason Momoa doesn't feel like you're just watching Aquaman on Planet Dune. He feels like a character. Exactly. Right. He's giving a performance, which is refreshing to see.
The cast, great all around. The visual effects they're up there with all the best movies ever made, I would say.
Superb.
The scaling. One of the other directors who I think does scaling really well is Gareth Edwards. And when you look at this movie, especially with the sandworms, the scaling is just immense. When you look at it, you feel that they are actually that size, or the structures that they're walking through, and the ornithopters and everything about it.
It feels very tangible.
Yeah.
And we've got to shout out the musical score from Hans Zimmer. It kind of brings the whole thing together. It's not the most, I've said this before, it's not the score you just want to listen to on repeat and repeat, like maybe some of John Williams' most famous themes or something like that, but it's so perfectly complemented to this film. It's tailor-made to this film, and Hans Zimmer, I think, passed up a Christopher Nolan movie to compose for this film because it's also a passion project for him. He's going very unique. Every sort of, house or family or planet or creed and clan in the film kind of has their own musical identity, and then Paul himself has his own sort of theme that is just like really powerful, and they drop the needle on these tracks at just the perfect moments in the film. Like they know how to build the cinematic moment with very little, a strong close up and just the right music playing, and it feels like you're watching cinema unfold. It's very powerful.
I was lucky enough to see this in IMAX, and this is a movie that has to be seen on a big screen. And we always talk about how we rate movies not necessarily on a 1 to 10 scale. I mean, it kind of just ends up being that way.
Yeah.
We rate them on the experience, like how much was I transported? How much was I transformed?
How effective was the film at delivering what I feel like it wanted me to experience?
And so now I kind of talk about like the only few negatives, and that this movie barely didn't make that 10 out of 10 experience because it does suffer from a little bit of part 1 syndrome towards the end.
A little bit.
The last act of this movie doesn't feel like you have rising action and then falling action and the resolution. It kind of feels like tiny little bumps
Yeah,
here and there
it-
with the sandstorm, and then he has to fight the other Fremen who was in his vision, who he thought was going to be his friend. It
Yeah.
kind of, and it doesn't feel like a dud.
Yeah.
But especially on the first watch, I was like, wow, this is a little anticlimactic.
Yeah, I'd say the back kind of third of the movie has a little awkward pacing, because in terms of what they're really playing into and setting up, the sort of fall of House Atreides, if you will, kind of feels like that's what the whole film is pushing towards. So once you kind of have that big sort of climactic moment, it feels like that's kind of where you might typically want to wrap it up, but you'd be wrapping it up on a bit more of a cliffhanger, downer, sort of open end. And I can understand not wanting it, trying to move through the narrative a little bit more to a bit more of a resolved moment, but it feels a little bit in the same way that the T-Rex in the city at the end of The Lost World feels like a little bit of a epilogue to the main island story of that film. The sort of what Jessica and Paul do out in the desert after their escape, it feels a little bit like the sort of the epilogue to what the main story was. And I'm sure it seems like maybe there's a difficult point to where do you end part one, where do you begin part two, and maybe a little awkward. I'm sure once both parts are completed, it'll flow completely well, but you can tell they sort of make a climax for Paul that it didn't feel like the film was pushing toward, and maybe there are some things they could have done to kind of set up and foreshadow and make it feel like you were constantly pushing to this finale with Paul, but that's neither here nor there, and that's really ultimately some minor quibbles.
Yeah, the movie does run a tiny bit long, but like you said, where do you draw the line of let's end it here and pick it up here and this part of this book or this part of that book? But
if you say you cut this movie 20 minutes faster, that's 20 minutes that then must still be carried and shouldered with part two. So maybe
Right.
they were very clear on how they wanted to pace themselves and structure it. Maybe there wasn't a perfect choice, but maybe in the long term it'll feel like the best one they could have made.
right, I think on the whole, for me, if I were to give it like a score, I would give it like a 9.5, only because that part one syndrome kind of does affect it just a little bit.
Yeah.
However, once part two drops, which I hear is getting Dark Knight levels, Empire Strikes Back levels of praise from other filmmakers,
Yeah.
that entire experience will elevate it to a 10.
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying?
I get a sense. Yeah, I'd say it's all like 9 out of 10 for this one, and then but the duo will have that. It'll be a 10 out of 10. It'll be just a double feature that people have in the same way that they binge all three Lord of the Rings movies.
So that's pretty much going to wrap it up for our thoughts and our review of Dune Part 1. A little late to it, but we wanted to bring it so we have it and it's out there. So overall, it's an amazing movie, epic in every sense of the word. Definitely worth watching on the biggest screen possible whenever possible.
Yeah.
And we absolutely cannot wait for Part 2.
Yeah, it's aged very well, and I think part two will only enhance its viewing over the years.
All right, well, thanks for stopping by. Have a good one.